Welcome to part 6 of the American Revolution. Now we're going to take a look at George Washington at war. So with the war objectives in mind now, let's take a look again at the appointment of George Washington to the head of the Continental Army, right? George Washington was appointed that position, but he wasn't appointed there to defeat the British Army. His position was charged with breaking the British will to fight. He basically was told, look, we don't expect you to defeat the British Army. Just keep your army in the field. Don't let it get destroyed. Now, we already know that Washington doesn't have this stellar military record, but what he does have going in his favor is he does have a knack for keeping an army in the field, right? Remember, he kept his army from being destroyed there at Fort Necessity, and he managed to get Braddock's army out of the Ohio River Valley as well, right? So he was nominated by the Continental Congress on June 17, 1775 to take over that Massachusetts militia and use that to create the core of the Continental Army. Now, the force that he's going to inherit here, this Massachusetts militia, is quite a mess. Now, it's large. It's about 15,000 men strong now, and they're operating out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? But they're unorganized, right? Their officer corps is done by election, right? It's a little bit it's a little bit haphazard. There's no military discipline. But the one thing you can say for them is they have put Boston under siege. Right, those men have got Boston completely bottled up, and Thomas Gage is stuck inside the city. Matter of fact, Thomas Gage, because of his disastrous performance in that skirmish in Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Breed's Hill, okay, Bunker Hill, he gets fired. Right, he gets recalled back to England, and he's replaced by William Howe. All right, so William Howe now commands the British garrison there in Boston. And when Washington arrives and takes command, he sizes up the situation and he decides that he needs to put more pressure on the British there in Boston. What he does is he has his men go onto another peninsula that overlooks Boston Harbor called Dorchester Heights, and he's going to use those guns that were taken at Fort Ticonderoga, right, and he's going to fortify that hilltop. So he sends Brigadier General John Thomas with 800 soldiers and 1,200 workers to Dorchester Heights, and they begin digging in and making fortified embankments there, right? So when March 4th, 1776 rolls around, the fortifications are all set, and William Howe looks at the situation, and he remembers this. Remember, he was the one that was charged with taking taking Breed's Hill before. He sees this situation and goes, you know what, there's really no reason for me to stay here in Boston. My brother can keep the entire port bottled up and make Boston basically useless, at least from outside influence. So he takes his 11,000 troops, that's how many were there by that point, and about 1,000 loyalists, and on March 17, 1776, he sets sail with them to Halifax, Nova Scotia, in order to reorganize and decide where he wants to go from there. So the siege on Boston is over, and Boston has been liberated. So around the same time that the Continental Congress is sending Washington up to take over the Massachusetts militia, they are also setting their eyes on Canada to see if they can invade it and take it and add that to the revolutionary fold, right? They're going to send General Richard Montgomery up there. They're going to have him attack Canada from the west, right? Now remember, the key to Canada is Quebec, and so Montgomery's ultimate task is capturing Quebec, but he's going to come in from the west. And on November 13th, 1775, he is going to capture the city of Montreal on the St. Lawrence River. So then he can advance westward and move to Quebec from there. Now, at the same time, another force under the command of Colonel Benedict Arnold is going to come from the east. Right? He's going to march across Maine and come towards Quebec from the eastern direction. So you have these two forces that are going to meet each other there and lay Quebec under siege in the winter of 1775, right? Now, the conditions there are horrible, right? It's Canada, it's wintertime, it's cold. I mean, that's just a truism. It's cold in Canada in the winter, okay? And these men have this city under siege. They're in these freezing conditions there on the plains of Abraham. Meanwhile, the British forces are inside the city of Quebec. They're not going to do like Montcalm did and go marching out and have some kind of decisive battle. Okay, so they're in winter quarters. They're in these nice warm houses, fires, maybe sipping brandy, who knows? Okay. And so conditions are really bad for the men out there in the field, and things are about to get worse for Montgomery and Arnold because the end of the year is coming up. And of this 1,200 man force that they have here outside of Quebec, a lot of them, not all of them, but most of them, their enlistments are going to end at midnight, December 31st, 1775. And how are you going to convince them to stay after that? How are you going to convince them to sign up for another year? I mean, what do you do? Go up to them and say, hey, I see you still have most of your toes, right? How would you like to sign up for another year of this, right? So I think it was really an act of desperation when the siege of Quebec, they decided to end it on December 31st during the day with a straight-on attack. This is a disaster, right? On December 31st, 1775, they are going to march on the city. There's a snowfall coming down, so they think, oh, good, we got some cover. But it's one of those icy snows. So when you're walking in, it's like, crunch. It's like you're walking on popcorn, right? And they get discovered, and the British garrison opens fire on them. One of the very first things that happens in the first minutes of the battle is General Montgomery takes a cannonball right to the face. I can say this pretty conclusively. It's usually not a good idea to ever take a cannonball to the face, right? Just, there you go. There's a life lesson for you. Write that one down. Always true. Okay. So he's obviously dead. And Arnold now has to take command. Now, Arnold also gets very severely wounded during this battle. He'll be wounded in the right thigh. And the casualties will be just terrible. 400 out of the 1,200 men will go down as casualties. Arnold will have to get these men mustered together and begin to withdraw. And they withdraw into back southeastward or southwestward rather, and back into New York. Now, meanwhile, we still have General Howe there in Halifax, Nova Scotia, right? But he's refitting. He's getting ready to go. He's getting his troops trained. He hires 20,000 mercenaries from the German state of Hesse-Kassel, right? This is why we call them Hessians, right? But they're Germanic people. So he has 20,000 mercenaries, and he decides where does he want to land next. Well, he decides he wants to attack New York. He's got Boston bottled up. If he can attack New York, he'll take another major port, and he's just a very short march away then from taking the colonial revolution capital of Philadelphia. So on July 2nd, 1776, he's going to land on Staten Island, right? His initial landing force consisted of about 9,000 professional soldiers on 130 ships, but others will follow. The mercenaries will begin landing. By August 12th, that force had grown to about 31,000 men and a protective fleet of 427 vessels. George Washington knows the importance of New York City, and even though a lot of people say it's surrounded by water on three sides, you got the Royal Navy there, it's impossible to defend. He is still going to try at least to counter Howe's advancement on the city. If he can't keep him from taking it, he's going to try and at least slow him down. Now, the battles around New York are really a hot mess, right? For one, Washington's trying his hardest not to directly engage the bulk of Howe's forces because he knows if he does that, he's so outnumbered that he's pretty likely to get destroyed. And remember, one of the things he's tasked with is keeping an army in the field. But August and September is just a process of escaping from New York, right? Howe will confront Washington and defeat him in the Battle of Brooklyn Heights on the 27th of August, 1776, right? He's going to have to fall back to the East River, right? On September 15th, Howe will attack Washington again at Harlem Heights, right, in Manhattan, and he's going to be forced off the island of Manhattan and onto New York State proper, right? So From this point, between October and November, he's going to continue withdraw and withdraw into New Jersey. And that's pretty much what you're going to see here, is continual withdrawals. And his army is being whittled down during this time. I mean, his 15,000 large force has been dropped through casualties and disease and capture and desertions to a force that's about 5,000 strong at this point, right, by the time we reach October. But he has kept the army in the field, so he's at least done that. It hasn't been destroyed, but, I mean, it's going to start getting desperate because he, by the end of the year, is going to have the same problem that Montgomery and Arnold had before the year prior up outside of Quebec. He's got enlistments that are going to end. Okay, so by September, Washington's out of New York City, right? And Howe takes command of it, and the British will hold New York City for the rest of the war. Howe will make it the base of operations for the northern British forces and kind of have an unhealthy obsession with the city after that, one that will ultimately get him fired. And he'll send his best general, General Charles Cornwallis, to continue to chase Washington. Cornwallis in October and November and the beginning of December is going to chase Washington all the way across New Jersey. And Washington's going to suffer a series of defeats in the process. He's going to lose Fort Washington and Fort Lee. He's going to be defeated at White Plains in October. And then finally, on December 7th, 1776, Washington's army is hemmed up against the Delaware River on the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, right? Cornwallis is approaching that position as night falls, and he's preparing for the next day where he's going to hopefully crush Washington's army and end the war. But in the dead of night, Washington's first crossing of the Delaware, not the famous one, but his first one, he will spirit his entire army across the Delaware River, and Cornwallis is going to wake up on December 8th and see that the entirety of Washington's army is gone. At that point, Cornwallis decides, well, it's time to make winter quarters. We will pick up this chase of Washington next year. But Washington is going to have to do something different. So while Cornwallis's men are making winter's quarters there, Washington's got a real problem, right? He has an issue in that he has 3,000 of his 5,000 man force whose enlistments are going to end on December 31st. And there's a pretty good chance that these guys are going to just walk away. I mean, morale is tremendously low. I mean, think about it. They've spent the entire year being handed defeat after defeat after defeat. How do you get them to reenlist and say, hey, look, we've really sucked at fighting this year. How would you like to sign up for another year at being really bad at fighting? See, I mean, it's not a very good selling point. Morale is low. Recruitment's low. You got to do something to inspire these men. So what Washington comes up with is a daring raid against those winter quartering troops of Cornwallis, right? He decides to take his men and attempt to cross the Delaware River on Christmas Day, 1776, right? Now, of the men who try to cross, only one regiment is actually going to successfully cross this ice-choked river, right? The 14th Continental Regiment, commanded by Colonel John Glover, will be the only one that makes it across, right? But it's enough. They're going to attack these Hessians that are in winter quarters in Trenton, and these Hessians are going to discover that there is kein Weihnachtsmann, right? There is no Santa Claus. There is a whole bunch of colonial fighters, however, right? The Hessians were commanded by a man named Johann Rall, and he, along with 21 of his other men, will be killed in the attack, the surprise attack. An additional 893 of the total 1,600-man force will be captured, okay? So, this is a great victory, right? Well, yeah, I guess you can call it that, but it's not a major victory. It's not a battle victory, right? Because remember, this is just a raid. And it's also important to note that this is not a turning point of the war. It's not a turning point. It is important, though. It's important in the fact that it improved the morale of Washington's army. So it did increase the amount of people that re-enlisted for another year, and it also increased recruitment. And also, very importantly, it increased the faith of the Continental Congress in Washington's command. They're getting really nervous, right? I know they told them, don't get defeated, but now, I mean, the British forces are on the cusp of getting to Philadelphia. They're getting a little bit nervous. So much so, in fact, that they're actually going to abandon Philadelphia and move to Baltimore for right now. Okay, this is going to, some people in the Continental Congress in 1776 are saying, I think we picked the wrong guy. I think we might need to have a change here, right? After the Trenton raid, there was a little bit of relief. Like, okay, all right, maybe we did pick the right guy.